the creature that had recently responded to the Rudis ritual. Giselle had no idea what thoughts were currently going through her mistress's head, but it didn't matter to her. And Esther knew that in order to carry out her insidious plan, she would need the help of a faithful servant who was not against it. To do this, the lady asked the girl to pretend to be one of the priestesses and come to her friend, who was also a servant. Giselle obediently began to spread the rumors that Esther had told her and pretended to be frightened at the sight of the emperor. But in fact, the assistant deliberately made it so that the man could hear what she said and would get angry. Although the false priestess tried hard to pretend that she felt guilty, she was actually happy. 3 days later, Seriphus came to Rudis, who knew nothing about the gossip, with an important proposal that surprised her. The guy said that first, it would be a good idea for them to visit a city that had been damaged by monsters called Harta, but the heroine was only scared when she heard the Sir's promise that those people would be in debt after saving them. The princess did not like the fact that by helping someone she was forcing someone to subsequently serve her faithfully, all because the most important thing for the girl was to gain her own freedom and not other people's. However, the lady clenched her fists as she realized that she could not leave the inhabitants of the empire in trouble, even if she suffered. Seriphus was surprised when the princess suddenly asked what his father thought about their whole rescue plan. The princess was indeed unsure whether they should really go to Harta first. Somewhat later, the emperor gathered his people to tell them about the first point chosen for salvation. The man deliberately looked menacingly at everyone gathered, since discipline had been violated recently. The aristocrats shuddered a little from such a close gaze, and therefore nevertheless realized that they had been wrong earlier. The hardest thing for the counts and dukes was to refrain from starting another discussion about the summoned demon. Barthold was very angry at the fact that his subordinates began to think about switching to Rudis' side because of Lavaine. Then one of the assistants approached the ruler and carefully and quietly announced that his daughter had come to the meeting. The emperor was noticeably surprised by this, as Rudis had never attempted to participate in anything like this before. Nevertheless, he allowed his daughter to enter, and soon the lady appeared before all those gathered together with Count Seriphus. His Majesty did not know exactly what to expect from the girl who came to him so unexpectedly. As a result, the man was the first to start a dialogue and asked the lady what the purpose of her return was if she had run away so quickly before. But the heroine responded to this accusation quite calmly, saying that she had not abandoned anyone, as her father for some reason believed. Barthold guessed that now Miss would accuse him in response, so he tried to change the subject of the conversation as quickly as possible. He asked his daughter to tell him what she wanted, and the girl confidently declared that she would like to go to Villainess instead of the chosen Harta. But the ruler was sure that it was already too late to save that city, because it had gone through all 5 stages of infection. But the princess believed that her father had not chosen Harta because the place really needed help. Rudis asked loudly in front of everyone if the ruler had really decided to help this city just for the sake of its power and money. Hearing this question, the aristocrats immediately shuddered nervously because they knew that this was indeed the case. Suddenly, one of the counts could not stand it any longer and stood up for his master in order to continue to look good in his eyes. But the lady was not at all taken aback when the man began to accuse her and asked if he really believed what he was saying. However, the aristocrat continued to insist that the girl simply did not know the real state of affairs. Realizing that the count was merely defending the emperor, the other nobles immediately adopted his position and began to shout as well. As a result, the heroine found herself in the very center of people scolding her, who spoke only in order to protect the ruler. Just as the lady wanted to end these disputes on her own, one of the lords suddenly asked his allies to be silent. Rudis looked in surprise at the man who, for some reason, so unexpectedly decided to help her and sort out the situation. It turned out to be Earl Abbot, who continued to sit confidently in his place because he knew that he would be listened to. However, Count Claudin still tried to object to him, saying that he was simply out of his mind since he was asking everyone to be silent. But for the princess, it was already important that the guy, for some reason unknown to her, at least somehow tried to help in the end. But apart from the man who began to be indignant, no one else dared to argue, since they knew that the lady was right. Abbott specifically announced that it was simply more profitable to help Hart, but that was not the reason they gathered. Rudis completely agreed with the guy's words, since she herself thought exactly the same, and that's why she wanted to help Villainess. Although the heroine was still not confident that she would be listened to even with such support, she decided to try. So she openly told her father that Villainess was supposed to be the first point where they would go to save people. Hearing this, the emperor immediately pressed his lips together so tightly that it was noticeable even to the naked eye. Imagine the princess's surprise when the man very easily agreed with absolutely everything she said. His Majesty noticed the lady's confused face and asked if she was unhappy that he had accepted everything. In fact, the emperor did this for a reason, but only because he knew something important. Giselle, under the cover of a priestess, told him that Lavaine could not be called a complete deity. So it turned out that the demon was just an ancient half-god who had lesser powers. But Rudis didn't know all this information, so she sincerely didn't understand why the ruler agreed to everything. As the girl thought, Barthold finally declared that their squad would not receive even a drop of help from the imperial army. But what scared the lady was not even this, but the fact that for some reason the emperor did not believe that Lavaine would be able to deal with the monsters. The heroine looked closely at her father, trying in vain to understand what was happening, because he didn't say anything else. But the princess had no intention of becoming his bargaining chip once again, so she also hid her emotions in response. As soon as Miss returned to the Duke of Arctus's estate, the servants immediately brought her a huge and soft blanket. The assistants also brought a lot of tasty and healthy food that could be stored for quite a long time. The heroine watched everything that was happening with great amazement, as she could not understand what exactly was happening. Only a little later, the butler explained to the lady that they had prepared everything for her most comfortable journey. Rudis replied, somewhat awkwardly out of embarrassment, that she didn't need so many things with her on the road to fight monsters. But the man insisted that the princess not refuse the help they had prepared for her. The miss asked with concern why even her personal assistants were trying so hard for her well-being. Imagine Rudy's surprise when the butler explained that the servants were helping her only because they were very grateful. In order to explain the whole situation to the princess, the assistant took some time to gather his words, thinking how to explain everything. He finally revealed that his master had turned to many for help due to his lack of money and power. The princess had no idea that the duke's position was so difficult in aristocratic society, so she sadly said that she would definitely support Father Serephus in everything if it was needed in the future. With a smile, the man said that it was precisely for this attitude of the lady that all the servants around were grateful and appreciative. The next morning, due to anxiety before the trip, the heroine woke up before sunrise and went out onto the balcony. The girl expected to be alone for some time and collect her thoughts, when suddenly she heard a familiar voice behind her. It turned out that Lavaine, who did not feel the cold at all, unlike her, came to talk to the princess. Rudis immediately remembered that she wanted to tell the guy that a horse had been prepared for him, so she told him about it now. The demon thanked the lady and explained that he simply wanted to feel like a human being, and that was why he decided to ride a horse. But Miss could not understand why such sensations were necessary for such an ancient and powerful deity. However, the girl was now much more worried about the recent words of her father, who did not believe in her at all. Because of him, she even began to worry about whether everything would really go well, although she didn't talk about it. However, the heroine still admitted to Lavaine that she was worried about what they would do when they arrived in the city. But then the guy, without even listening to his mistress's concerns to the very end, for some reason began to laugh, which was noticeable. Eventually, the demon explained that this was not something the princess needed to worry about at the moment, as he could handle it. Rudis didn't expect the deity to suddenly say that she could fear absolutely nothing as long as it was by her side. When a little later the lady was already riding in the carriage, she was still thinking about the words that the summoned demon had recently said to her. But Miss still couldn't be sure that Lavaine's abilities would actually work as intended. Suddenly, distracting the heroine from her thoughts, Serephis turned to her and said that they had almost arrived at the right city. This caused Miss to nod excitedly, as she was not fully prepared for her next steps. Suddenly, looking out the window, the heroine saw a terrible red smoke that was rising high into the sky from the ground itself. The lady immediately realized that everything was happening because of the work of those very monsters, and this scared her quite a lot. Since Rudis lacked information regarding what was happening, she plucked up her courage and called Sir. What the princess was most worried about was what the final stage of monster infestation would be like. The princess only knew that there were only 5 stages in the classification, but she had never heard of another one before. Duke Arctus's son was surprised to hear that the emperor's daughter did not know about another stage of the land's contamination. How scared the girl was when she heard that the final stage meant that the monsters turned people into themselves. Lavaine, who was riding next to the lady, added that people named the stage that way because they felt their end was approaching. However, Miss still could not believe that monsters could become intelligent beings. Even seeing the lady's fear, the demon still added that at the final stage, the monsters could even perform rituals. But the princess still didn't understand why exactly these creatures needed this kind of ritual. In response, the deity smiled sadly, because he knew that the answer would most likely bring his mistress into real horror. As the son of Duke Arctus, Seriphus also knew what the essence of the monster's actions was, which made it no less difficult for him. In the end, Lavaine did say that monsters perform rituals to turn people into the same monsters. As he expected, Rudis's eyes widened greatly due to the fear that pierced her from head to toe from what she heard. Only now did the heroine realize that the monsters could actually defeat the Empire if they performed many such rituals. A few hours later, the entire detachment stopped for a rest so that they could calmly reach their destination in the morning. At the same time, Rudis was still sitting in the carriage and sadly thinking that she could not believe that the Empire would fall so easily. Since the girl did not get out of the carriage, Seriphus decided to approach her in order to at least try to console the lady a little. The guy deliberately began the dialogue delicately because he first wanted to understand what mood the girl was in at the moment. Sir even asked for forgiveness for not telling him right away about the monsters performing rituals because he could not find the right moment. But Rudis assured the guy that nothing had really changed, even if she had heard about it earlier. Suddenly, the miss asked if the Duke's son would kill people who accidentally became monsters, which ended up surprising him greatly. Seriphus frowned and took a moment to gather his words, as this was a sore subject for him. He reminded the girl that just recently, even Lavaine had said that the reverse transformation was impossible. No matter how hard the demon tried, he could not find a solution to this problem yet, although he actually knew a lot of things. As a result, due to all the worries, the lady could hardly stop her hands from shaking, as she was very afraid of the future. The princess understood that the responsibility for people who had become monsters was too heavy a burden. But then the lady was brought back to reality by the Sir, who gently called the girl, seeing that she began to tremble with fear. Rudis was very surprised when the guy suddenly said that he understood perfectly well how difficult it was for her in this situation. However, the Duke's son reminded that he was next to the miss, so she should not carry everything on her shoulders alone. The heroine did not expect that in her life there would ever be a person who would so sincerely want to help. And the guy at that moment declared that he would make every effort to help the Emperor's daughter destroy all the monsters in the Empire. After which, with a completely serious face, the heir of the Arctus family asked Rudis to at least rest a little now. At the same time, the guy himself could not get that look in the lady's eyes out of his head when she was very frightened by the information. These emotions gave Seriphus a strong desire to help the princess cope with her task at any cost. After several hours of restless sleep, Rudis suddenly opened her eyes, as she was absolutely unable to fall asleep anymore. For this reason, she decided to go outside and take a walk, but realized that it was cold enough for her outside the carriage. Suddenly, the heroine felt someone's light touch on her shoulder, which caused her to immediately turn towards that person. Behind her, the lady immediately saw Lavaine, who appeared in front of her again, as he wanted to talk after some time. The demon noted, somewhat displeased, that he knew about how Seriphus came to the girl to support her before the battle. Rudis, without knowing why, suddenly felt awkward, although she was absolutely not guilty of anything. But then the guy explained that he simply didn't like noticing so much human attention around the sweet princess. After these words of the deity, Miss wondered if he was really on much worse terms with Sir Arctus than she thought. Suddenly, Lavaine asked if Rudis really liked nice words and good deeds from other people. Hearing this, the Emperor's daughter was noticeably surprised, as she did not think that the demon would ever ask her something like this. However, the heroine told her assistant that any person would like it if someone said something good to him. In response, the guy said that it didn't matter what Lady Seriphus said, because he was the only one who was important in the girl's life. The princess did not quite understand why the deity was telling her such words, but still did not try to argue with him now. Suddenly, the boy and girl were interrupted by the son of Duke Arctus, who approached them in a hurry, as the sky was quickly brightening. Rudis was not prepared for the fact that they already had to move on, so she clearly had a look of fear on her face. So the princess shrank inwardly, although she tried her best not to show her fear to all the other people. After several hours of travel, the heir of Arctus turned to the lady, informing her that they had arrived and would have to continue on foot. The princess was overcome by terrible and disturbing thoughts as she got out of the carriage to finally reach Vigneux. And Rudis had reasons to worry so much, since the area around really did look very scary and incomprehensible. Meanwhile, Seriphus gave instructions to the soldiers so that they knew how to behave correctly and in what situations. Suddenly, Lavaine intervened in the conversation of the heir of Arctus, who said that he too should have remained by the carriage. But the guy himself firmly decided that he really wanted to help, so he would definitely go on the journey with the princess and the demon. In response, the summoned deity did not argue, but only nodded in agreement, since he could not forbid the Sir anything. But the picture that opened up before the detachment was so terrible that it plunged everyone into complete horror. There was a huge amount of human remains lying around, which had obviously been abandoned there for quite some time. As a result, the heroine was so frightened that she never moved even a meter away from the son of Duke Arctus. The girl asked anxiously if there were any survivors, to which Lavaine confidently replied that they must have remained somewhere. Rudy's, with panic on her face, said that she had no idea that the situation in the city could be so dire and difficult. But Seraphis reassured the lady, saying that even if she had found out about everything, she still would not have been able to help them right away. To this, the princess asked where exactly the remaining people were, as she wanted to try to save them from the monsters in time. In response, Arctus promised that he would immediately escort the lady to the right place and would also do everything to help the victims. The demon silently watched the friends' conversation from the sidelines, although in fact he completely shared their desire to act. Lavaine was keeping a close eye on his mistress, so he managed to approach her and catch her at the moment when the miss almost fell. Seraphis also noticed that the princess was not feeling well, so he ran up to her and asked how she was feeling. Since the heroine did not want to attract attention, she lied that everything was fine with her, although this was not true at all. At this, the lady looked at Lavaine and realized that he was not human, so it was much easier for him to bear such things. At the same time, Miss realized that Sir, just like herself, could hardly catch his breath because of everything that was happening. But the heroine felt so insignificant and helpless compared to them that she was very sad about it. Since Rudis was really very tired, Arctus picked her up and quickly delivered her to the right place. It was in these ruins that the monsters gathered in large numbers, as the building was very convenient for their purposes. Seraphis lowered Rudis to the ground and looked around the area, concluding that they had arrived at the right place. But the guy didn't know how to open the doors for them, and the Emperor's daughter couldn't help him with this matter either. Suddenly, Lavaine spoke up, reminding him that Miss could have given him an order regarding the monsters at any moment. The princess had completely forgotten how the demon's powers were activated, so she was noticeably surprised. Then the guy once again said that in order for him to start acting, he needed to receive a clear order from the lady. The heroine did not particularly believe that the deity would fulfill any of his instructions within the limits of his powers, if she only said one word. Right now, Miss really wanted the ominous doors that were in front of them to open as soon as possible. It was for this reason that the girl loudly ordered Lavaine to open the doors to the monster building for her and her squad. In response, Lavaine agreed, and immediately those same heavy and unwieldy doors swung open in front of the people. Seraphis was so surprised by what he saw that he couldn't immediately believe what was happening before his face. Even Rudis didn't understand how the demon could so easily do what she had asked just a few seconds ago. But the divine creation itself, as if nothing had happened, was the first to head into the passage, calling everyone else to follow. Inside the room, everything was just as terrible as outside, although instead of skulls, there were strange black cocoons hanging around. The princess did not notice their presence until something sticky and very unpleasant fell right on her head. As soon as the lady began to wonder what it was, Sir Arctus appeared next to her and asked the miss not to raise her head up. The guy's face was so gloomy that it was completely impossible to understand what exactly he was feeling right now. The heroine wanted to ask a few questions, but noticed how much Seraphis was trembling and therefore remained silent. Instead, the princess focused on the path forward. As the closer they got, the louder the monsters' voices became. Throughout the journey, the Duke's heir tried his best to support the Emperor's daughter, which the deity soon noticed. Unexpectedly for the two friends, the demon stopped in the middle of the road and turned to face them, clearly wanting to say something. And only after a few seconds, Lavaine asked the lady to come to him, as he wanted to help her himself. Hearing the call of the assistant, the lady was noticeably surprised, even though the fatigue from the journey was much stronger than the rest. However, although even the girl's hands were shaking violently, she collected her thoughts and still extended her hand to the assistant. As soon as she did this, the guy immediately, with a deft movement, carefully pulled the princess towards himself, surprising her with this. No matter how surprised the heroine was by what was happening, the deity was in no hurry to explain to her the motives for his actions. The only thing the demon said was that the lady would soon understand everything, so she shouldn't worry so much. But even after listening to all these words, Rudis could not calm down completely, although she became noticeably more focused. After a couple of dozen minutes, the whole company finally came to the right door, which was located at the very top of the monster's building. At the sight of her, Rudis was once again gripped by anxiety and fear, but determination and confidence still sparkled strongly in the girl's eyes. Seraphis also felt uneasy about what they were about to see behind that door, but the boy desperately tried to be braver. He even opened the door first, allowing the princess to hide behind his back so as not to get accidentally hurt. However, despite this protection, Rudis was still so scared that her eyes widened at what she saw. It turned out that they accidentally found themselves in the very center of a ritual that monsters were conducting to turn people into themselves. The city's inhabitants were subjected to severe torture, which was clear from their faces, distorted with pain and their screams. And the monsters themselves, as if nothing had happened, continued to perform their ritual as they wanted to completely take over this place. Seeing all this, the heroine was paralyzed with fear because she did not want these creatures to suddenly notice them. The girl did not want to believe that everything that was happening was the end, and even more so, she did not want to die in this way. As the monsters rushed towards them in droves, the lady screamed for Lavaine to get rid of all the monsters around. After a few moments, as a deafening silence suddenly fell, Miss decided to open her closed eyes. Imagine the princess's surprise when she discovered that all the monsters around her had finally become human again. Rudis stood frozen in shock, not believing that such a thing was possible, and the demon explained that he had simply fulfilled her wish. Noticing that his mistress remained confused even after these words, the boy came closer and leaned towards her, after which he gently stroked the confused girl's cheek to make her understand that everything was really fine now. Although Lavaine's expression remained sad, he said contentedly that he had done as his princess had wished. A few minutes later, the returned people began to run about their business, trying to return the city to a working state, and only one heroine sat still and still tried to cope with her fear, which was stronger than her. She was so worried about everything that had happened that she couldn't stop her hands from shaking for a moment. The lady couldn't understand what kind of powerful force Lavaine used that he was able to save absolutely all people. But what scared Miss most was that the power of the deity depended entirely on her and how much she wanted to get what she wanted. Rudis constantly thought about what would happen if the demon used such powerful abilities against people instead of monsters. Looking at the guy who stood silently and collectedly at a distance, the princess wondered if she could really control him. Suddenly, Seraphis approached the girl and said that all the survivors really wanted to thank her for saving them. The emperor's daughter was very surprised when she heard about this, because she thought that, in essence, she had done absolutely nothing. But Sir Arctus insisted that the people of Vigneau wanted to see the princess, even though she might not come out to meet them. In response, the lady thought for a moment and glanced out of the corner of her eye once again at the summoned demon who had recently helped her. Eventually, Miss agreed to talk to people, since she still needed to distract herself from bad thoughts. But for Rudis, who was now emerging from the shadows into the light, it remained unclear why the residents wanted to talk to her. Imagine the girl's surprise when, as soon as she appeared in front of people, they immediately joyfully shouted her name. One of the city's guardians stepped forward and announced that they were now indebted beyond repayment to the princess who had saved them. These words scared Rudis a little, because she knew that people should have respected her father, and besides, it was the demon who helped everyone recover. But the boy objected that although the ancient deity had dealt with the monsters, it was the lady who had brought him here to help. Although the residents of the town of Vigneau had asked for help from different people, until this moment, no one had tried to help them. For this reason, the keeper asked the mist to nevertheless accept worry about it. However, the girl could not stand aside, so she decided to act as soon as possible to achieve results. As a result, the miss immediately arrived at the imperial palace, where she was greeted with honor by the servants who had previously treated her with disdain. Rudis remembered very well how all these people silently watched her being bullied, so she was not going to trust anyone. Suddenly, a servant announced that the emperor was waiting for the girl in his chambers, which surprised her because not everyone could enter there. However, the princess tried not to show her emotions and calmly came to meet her father, not even knowing what to expect. Turning to face his daughter, the man showed how unhappy he was with the events happening around him. But what struck Rudis most was that Lavaine was already in the ruler's office, although she certainly hadn't called him to this place. The heroine managed to lose the demon, as he disappeared immediately upon arrival in the city, and it turned out that he was already with His Majesty. As the tense pause between father and daughter dragged on, he was the first to start the dialogue, albeit somewhat hesitantly. Barthold suddenly declared that he was very glad that the first princess had returned, since he had been very worried about her condition on the way. Rudis didn't expect the emperor to be so kind, but she guessed that he had only changed because of pressure from the aristocrats. Then His Majesty immediately got down to business and asked if the girl had really dealt with the monsters so easily. The emperor would like to hear that Rudis failed in her task, as it would be more profitable for him. He mentioned that he had learned something about the ritual for the deity from the priest, but the lady did not understand why her father was talking about this topic again. But before the miss had time to ask what the matter was, the emperor suddenly grabbed her and asked her to make Selena the victim now. The heroine could not even imagine that His Majesty would wish to again give one of his daughters into the hands of an ancient deity. Suddenly, their dialogue was interrupted by Lavaine, who heard everything perfectly well and laughed loudly throughout the room because of it. The demon admitted that he had never heard of a father sacrificing his children, especially so easily and casually. The deity admitted that he had met cruel men, but this was the first time he had encountered such a rotten person. The emperor began to object that he had not said anything strange, since Rudis remained alive, and therefore was not suitable as a sacrifice. These words made Lavaine frown, because everything was actually much more serious than people could imagine. The deity explained that the one who becomes a sacrifice must give all of his flesh and blood to the summoned creature. In response, Barthold shouted that since the first princess remained alive, then exactly the same should have happened to the second. However, the demon explained somewhat sadly that Rudis was completely different and was not subject to the general rules of the ritual. He reluctantly explained that the girl had already paid her price once, so she didn't need to die to summon someone. Hearing this, the heroine froze in shock, as she had no idea that she had ever sacrificed someone. At this point, Celine learned that the emperor had let her sister into his private chambers, which made the girl incredibly angry. The assistant only lowered her head even lower, as she saw with her own eyes how the eldest daughter came into the ruler's room. The second princess did not want to believe that Rudis would be able to take away everything she had, although such a chance was present. Esther noticed the doubts, and therefore, with a sly smile, reminded the lady that her father had once already given away her room. But what scared Selena most was the fact that her sister lived in the Duchy of Arctus, and it was she who wanted to marry Seraphis. So the lady couldn't hold back and threw the cup on the floor, screaming that she wouldn't allow Rudis to try to take her place so brazenly. The girl even promised that she would use her absolutely favorite methods, if only she could remain first. The maids watched with horror at such obvious madness of their mistress, but did not try to prevent her anger because they were afraid. And only Lady Ivana, who benefited greatly from the princess's behavior, could barely contain her malicious grin. Meanwhile, the heroine left the emperor's room, but still could not believe that he had such a terrible plan. The man was upset only by the fact that another ritual could not be performed in the near future, although he really wanted to. But then, distracting the princess from such heavy thoughts, Lavaine extended his hand to her, wanting to support his mistress. But Rudis did not immediately understand what exactly the deity wanted from her, so she stared at her assistant in surprise. Then the guy explained that he thought it was still normal among people to take the arm of someone close to them. To this, the princess replied that she thought that the demon would disappear again, and for some reason would not accompany her on her way back. Lavaine suddenly admitted that he was doing this because he wanted to indirectly apologize to the lady for not telling her everything. Although Rudis immediately lied that she was not upset about this at all, in fact she was very interested in knowing the whole truth. Besides, Miss knew that the demon could disappear back into chaos at any moment, so she wasn't going to rely on him. So the girl was going to continue to hide her true emotions from her assistant, because she thought it was right. Suddenly, the guy asked if the lady was definitely not lying when she said she wasn't upset, because it seemed to him that this was not the case at all. The heroine was very surprised that the deity was able to understand so quickly and easily what her true emotions really were. But the lady still didn't want to rely on the assistant in anything, so she again replied that everything was fine. Levane guessed that the lady was not ready to cooperate with him now, so he said goodbye and disappeared into thin air. Finally, he said that he would not blame Miss for anything, no matter what happened, and this hurt Rudis, so she became even more upset. So the lady had to return to the Duchy of Arctis alone again, although the estate itself looked cheerful, contrary to her mood. Rudis wanted to visit the temple before heading to the next city, and she came to Serefis with this question. The guy immediately offered to accompany the girl to the priests, but she replied that she would like to come on her own. The princess admitted that she was interested in something concerning Levane, and this is exactly what the lady would like to know about in the temple itself. The heroine couldn't get the demon's phrase out of her head about how she had already made her sacrifice once, but he didn't explain anything. However, Sir insisted on going to the temple with Miss if she was not too much against it. Arctis was very worried about Rudis' safety, and she noticed how tightly his fists clenched at the thought of her trip. So, in the end, the heroine still agreed to her friend's offer, because she understood that she could trust him in such matters. With such an escort, the Emperor's daughter quickly reached the place she needed, which she was very happy about inside. Bennett was incredibly happy to see Rudis, as they had been unable to finally see each other for quite some time. The princess herself could not help but smile sincerely when she saw the priest, since she knew that he could be trusted. When the miss began to ask the priest about Levane's powers, she noticed that he too could tell her little. The guy was especially surprised when he learned that the girl had already made a sacrifice and therefore remained alive. Rudy suggested that they think together about what such words of the ancient deity that was summoned by the ritual could mean. For some time, the high priest diligently tried to find at least some explanation for such strange and incomprehensible formulations. But in the end, he reported that these words could not be understood in any other way, so it turned out that God was telling the truth. Bennett reminded her once again that without a sacrifice, the ritual would not work, which meant that the lady had already given someone away. The heroine tried to explain that this was not the case, to which the guy stated that she might simply not remember this event. These thoughts made the girl incredibly scared, because considering herself a murderer was very unpleasant and terrible. All her life, Rudis lived in captivity and felt the hostile gaze of the imperial palace. The princess reported that, living in this way, she could not find a person for the ritual and conduct it herself. But the priest was not as upset as the young lady, since he believed that they had found out at least some information. He gently squeezed the lady's hand and asked her not to worry so much, because the temple would help her in her search for answers to these questions. The heroine had no choice but to sadly answer that she relied on her believing assistants. Since Bennett knew that Serefis was waiting for the lady outside, he did not accompany her personally, but only sent several priests with her. As Rudis walked along the temple corridor towards the exit, she noticed a familiar figure standing in the shadows ahead of her. The girl was very surprised when she recognized this man as her sister, who should now be in the imperial palace. However, the second princess was clearly in a very bad mood and told the eldest that she wanted to talk to her immediately. Rudis turned to her companions and said that they did not need to interfere, as she would definitely be completely fine. Since the lady was in a hurry, she asked her sister to express herself as briefly as possible, although she did not refuse to give her time. Hearing this, Selena became even more angry, as she was not pleased to hear that her elder sister had more work to do than her. Unable to bear it, the girl screamed loudly, asking why Rudis was doing so much for no apparent reason. But the heroine sincerely did not understand what exactly Selena's question was, since she was trying for the people. When the lady suddenly asked why the elder one didn't let her become the second victim, Rudis's eyes widened in surprise. Meanwhile, the fair-haired lady was seriously making all this noise just for such a stupid and dangerous reason for her. The second princess angrily asked if her sister was so angry that she wanted to take all the power of the deity for herself. The girl stated that they were related, so it was normal for them to share even something like this with each other. The heroine was amazed when she heard such words from Selena, because before she had not even remembered about their relationship. And now the emperor's second daughter brazenly asked that Levane now obey her in everything too. Rudis could not bear this any longer, so she asked the priest to leave them for a more personal dialogue. Before she began to speak, the first princess waited until the assistants had definitely left, and had heard absolutely nothing. After which, Rudis answered in all seriousness that she could not do what her younger sister insistently demanded of her. But Selena did not believe that something like this was beyond the powers of the first princess, because the thirst for power blinded her greatly. So the fair-haired lady desperately brought up the last argument that Rudis remained alive despite the ritual. For this reason, the girl was confident that everything would be fine with her if she too became a victim when calling on the deity. Imagine Rudis' surprise when the second princess accused her of not giving her the necessary strength because of old grievances. Feeling acutely offended, the heroine asked in a quiet voice if her sister really didn't understand what she was doing to her. But the younger one believed that she had merely locked the older one in a cold and separate palace near the imperial one. But Rudis also reminded the girl of all those bullying and hungry days, asking if that was really just a joke. However, even all these words did not make Selena feel remorse, as she only became more angry. The second princess even accused the first of being too arrogant, which could end badly for her. She asked the heroine if she really believed that the power she had belonged to her and not to the emperor. Showing all her angry emotions, Selena said that when Lavaine disappears, Rudis will once again become a useless invalid. Suddenly, after all these terrible speeches, the fair-haired lady heard Seraphis' familiar voice calling out to her from behind. Even the heroine herself did not notice how the guy unexpectedly approached her and her sister during their serious conversation about the future. Sir explained that he was waiting for the elder lady outside, but heard screams, and for this reason alone decided to find out what was happening in the temple. Before the guy could finish speaking, he was surprised by how much Selena's face changed when she heard him. He tried to call out to the second princess again, but she continued to stand a little to the side, ashamed. Rudis guessed that the lady did not want to show her bad side in front of Arctis, so she quickly ended the dialogue. But, realizing that Seraphis would really leave now, and they wouldn't even talk, the girl suddenly called him herself. Selena tried to explain that what she had just raised her voice was some kind of accident and never happened. To this, the Duke's son replied rather rudely that the miss did not need to justify herself to him, since he himself understood everything perfectly well. As a result, Selena was left in the corridor completely alone, which was what she was initially afraid of, since she did not want to lose Seraphis' trust. The princess even began to choke with emotion at the realization that at this rate, Rudis could take absolutely everything away from her. Biting her lips until they bled, Selena realized that she had only one way left to change everything that was happening. A few hours later, the heroine lay on her bed in the Arctis estate and thought about her sister's recent words. She herself understood perfectly well that there was a limit to everything, so she needed to find a way to gain her own powers. It was important for the princess to learn to defend her dignity without anyone's help, but for now, this was impossible. For this reason, the lady even squeezed the sheet tightly in her fingers, as she did not know what she needed to do next. At the moment, Rudis had no idea how she could obtain abilities that could protect her. The next morning, while the miss was dealing with work matters, the butler announced that they would have to postpone the trip to another city. He somewhat reluctantly revealed that urgent matters had arisen that Rudis had to attend. Imagine the heroine's surprise when the assistant informed her that a second ritual was planned very soon. Even Seraphis, who had encountered many different surprises in his life, did not believe what he heard at first. And only now did the heroine realize that Selena had come to the temple only to ask for a ritual. Arctis asked if His Majesty really supported this idea and decided to sacrifice his beloved daughter. The old man replied that the ruler was sure that the lady would survive since this happened to Rudis, which left everyone in shock. Sir immediately stated that they absolutely had to stop the ritual in order to save the girl. The first princess was hurt by the fact that the boy was also afraid that another demon would weaken her influence. Despite her bad relationship with her sister, Miss wanted to help her, so she asked if they could postpone their trip. The girl knew that delaying with the help of the infected cities was dangerous, but she could not leave Selena in trouble. However, Seraphis immediately supported Rudis, as he was worried that his plans might change with the appearance of a second deity. First of all, the first princess decided to at least try to see the second one in order to talk to her. But in the imperial palace, Lady Esther did not let the heroine see her sister, saying that she was preparing for a ritual. Sir Arctis stood up for the girl and asked the maid not to insult someone of imperial blood. The heroine herself at that moment was carefully thinking about how she should approach this self-confident woman. Ivana's face showed surprise when the lady asked if she wasn't worried about Selena, who would die after the ritual. However, this emotion quickly changed to a sly grin, since the woman knew how to protect herself. She came close to Rudis and said that she had returned healthy and was preventing her sister from gaining power. After which, Esther repeated the second princess's recent words, asking if the girl was afraid of becoming useless again. In fact, the heroine had no intention of pursuing such a goal, but absolutely no one listened to her. In parting, the assistant placed her hand on her former mistress's shoulder and then asked them to leave. As a result, Seraphis and Rudis were left completely alone in the corridor, and the guy asked the girl what they should do next. After thinking for a moment, the lady said that they needed to meet with the high priest as soon as possible. But this time, they encountered an obstacle in the form of a butler who would not let them see Bennett. The emperor's first daughter did not expect that all the preparations would be so serious, so she was upset. But the old man himself had no right to answer any of the missus' questions, for which he asked her forgiveness and advised her to leave. Only now did Rudis realize that she had suffered a complete defeat, although she had made many attempts to help. That evening, the heroine sat sadly in her room at the Arctis estate and thought about everything that had happened. The assistant gave a hint that the emperor had come up with a reason why the lady did not want the ritual, and therefore interfered with her. But the girl did not want to remain needed by everyone at the expense of the ancient deities, so she thought about what to do. While the lady was looking around the room with a confused look, she noticed one of her important things. It turned out to be a hairpin that she had specially taken with her to the previous ritual as a talisman. Suddenly, unpleasant memories of how cruelly her family looked at her before she was drafted came flooding into Rudis's head. Selena smiled openly and brazenly, because she did not feel sorry at all for her poor and unloved sister. The princess picked up the box in which she found the hairpin and wondered why she had to survive like this. The thought even suddenly flashed through the heroine's head that she could simply let her second daughter die. But Rudis immediately forbade herself to think in that direction, because such an act would be too vile. Taking the hairpin in her hands, the lady once again realized that it was not her sister who was to blame for all the horrors happening around her. So the heroine decided to save stupid Selena at all costs, or at least try to do it. The first princess's task was made easier by the fact that Sir Arctis had promised to talk to the aristocrats in order to influence them. But the girl was still worried that high society would insist on performing the ritual, as it had with her. So Miss ran out into the duchy's garden and said into the air that she really needed help from the ancient deity. But no matter how much the heroine walked around the garden in search of the demon, for some reason he still did not appear in front of her. After a few minutes of such calls, Rudis could not stand it and even gave in to panic, as she needed Lavaine. The lady remembered how the guy had recently whispered to her that she could call him at absolutely any time. But for some reason, contrary to his own words, the deity did not appear, no matter how much she desperately called for him now. The emperor's daughter clutched the hairpin tightly out of worry, since she could do nothing without the summoned creature. The heroine sincerely did not understand at what point and what exactly went wrong, since Lavaine suddenly stopped answering her. However, the next morning Rudis came to her sister's chambers, which the lady was immediately informed about by the maids. With a mocking grin, the second princess immediately told the first to be led into her room immediately. The lady was upset when she approached her sister and saw that she was indeed preparing for a ritual to summon an ancient deity. Selena herself was confident in her beauty and irresistibility at that moment, so she behaved calmly. The blonde miss told the emperor's unloved daughter that she would never be able to interfere with her plans. But the heroine suspected that the girl would not listen to her and called only to laugh at her. However, Rudis had a very important goal, so she suddenly began to move closer to her sister, who did not understand anything. Despite all the fears of the second princess, the first unexpectedly handed her some kind of incomprehensible hairpin. Since Selena was in no hurry to accept the gift from her hands, the eldest repeated once again that this thing needed to be taken with her. But in response, the young lady asked why she should even trust an unloved lady and take anything from her hands. In response to this, Rudis admitted that she really has not given up yet and wants to dissuade everyone from the ritual. But since no one listened to her, Miss decided to at least somehow protect her stupid little sister. Selena was very scared when she heard the advice to never stop fighting for her life in the cave. But before the younger daughter had time to object to the older one, the maid suddenly announced that it was time to go to the altar. Before leaving, the blonde girl rudely took the hairpin with her, although she said that it didn't mean anything. Rudy said nothing more, but continued to watch with alarm as the lady, who understood nothing about the ritual, was taken away. As soon as the emperor saw his daughter, he beamed with a joyful smile and said that they could begin as soon as possible. Selena felt a little awkward in her older sister's place, but tried not to show her emotions. Among all the assembled aristocrats, Only the heroine was genuinely concerned about everything that was happening. What worried her most was that Barthold, only because of his selfishness, was pushing his second daughter to certain death. The girl smiled at her father because she herself wanted to amaze everyone with her success with everyone else. The man kindly supported his daughter, who did exactly what he wanted, which made him very happy. He once again wished the girl good luck as she looked back. And at that moment, huge gates opened in front of Selena. At the ruler's command, the high priest immediately began to read the required prayer, although his voice trembled incredibly. The priest knew very well what price had to be paid for carrying out the summoning, so he could not help but be afraid. Suddenly, a huge crash was heard behind the doors, which did not happen the last time when Rudis was the victim. The emperor was somewhat alarmed by this result, and the priest could not explain anything, since he was only replacing Bennett. The heroine listened attentively to the sounds coming from behind the door, when suddenly a woman's scream pierced the space, begging for help. But despite this, Barthold said that it was necessary to wait a little longer, although the heroine begged the guards to open the gates. As if hearing her screams, the huge and heavy doors suddenly swung open in front of everyone who came to the ritual. But none of the aristocrats dared to move, because it was not clear what exactly was happening around them right now. Suddenly, a green-eyed blonde man, whom no one had seen before, walked out of the ritual room completely calmly. The guy smiled kindly as he greeted the people, but he didn't look any less threatening than before. The heroine was so scared because of this guy that she froze in place, as if struck by a huge lightning bolt. Suddenly, the lady heard Selena's scream again, and this alarmed the older sister even more because the younger one was nowhere to be seen. Rudis once again ordered the guards, who for some reason were still standing in place, to finally pull the princess out of the room. But before any of the assistants had even taken a couple of steps, suddenly an incomprehensible black smoke appeared from the doors. This strange thing slowly but surely began to approach people, but so far no one understood what to do with it. Suddenly, touching the man's body, the smoke began to wrap around him, which immediately caused panic among other people. Only Rudy stood in the middle of all this horror, and for some reason, not a single tendril of smoke touched her. Unexpectedly for the girl, the same guy who came out of the ritual room approached her, although she did not know him. He slowly and carefully looked at the heroine's face, and then grinned contentedly, drawing some conclusions about her to himself. Before the lady had time to answer the stranger, the guy asked if she wanted to check on the second princess in the room. Rudis only now realized that no one had come to the aid of the emperor's beloved daughter, so she ran herself. And the heroine didn't hear how the blonde man whispered after her with a cheerful grin that he was glad to see her, although she didn't remember him at all. At this moment, Rudis was trying with all her might in the darkness of the ritual room to find the second princess, who did not respond. Suddenly, after a few minutes of searching, the lady discovered her sister covered in some kind of red liquid sitting on the floor. She immediately ran up to her, trying to figure out if it was blood, and if the blonde girl, who was silently trembling, was injured. The heroine breathed a huge sigh of relief when she realized that this viscous liquid was not blood, although it matched the color. Here the lady noticed that Selena was in an insane state, as she continued to beg at least someone for help. At the same time, in her hands, pressing it tightly to her chest, the girl held the very same hairpin that her older sister had given her before the ritual. This made the emperor's unloved daughter remember herself and how much she was afraid during the ritual. So Miss couldn't hold back and screamed for the second princess to come to her senses, because they had to leave here. Only after this scream did Selena notice that she was no longer alone in this terrible and horrible place. Unexpectedly, the second daughter began to cry even more sadly and sorrowfully, as she had experienced very strong stress for herself. When Rudis helped Selena out a few minutes later, she discovered that the smoke was still periodically attacking people. At the sight of the girls, Barthold joyfully shouted that he knew that his beloved daughter would be able to do as he wanted, after which the man could not suppress his desire and glanced out of the corner of his eye at the second demon summoned to them. But the deity himself only smiled relaxedly in response and asked why the ruler was looking at him for some reason. To this, His Majesty declared that the demon must now use his abilities for the sake of Selena, who had become a victim. Imagine Barthold's surprise when the man he had called suddenly declared that he had no desire to do so. From the ruler's words, the boy guessed that someone had come to this place before him, and this immediately interested the ancient creature. He turned to Rudis, despite all the emperor's objections, and asked about the abilities of the first demon to appear here. The heroine felt a little sad talking about Levane because he didn't respond to her call, but she still had no other choice. So she said that the demon could make beautiful flowers bloom and then cause the leaves to fall on the trees. With a grin, the deity said that he himself had heard about such a romantic among them, so he understood perfectly well who was being talked about. Suddenly, the ancient creature began to confidently approach the lady, although she did not want to interact with it so closely. Nevertheless, the guy approached, and only after that said that his name was Kelster, asking the first princess to introduce herself. Rudis gave her name, although she was surprised that the demon was somehow addressing her and not Selena, who had summoned him. In response, the deity smiled again and said that he was now on her side, since the sacrifice had been received and he needed to work. The heroine asked with alarm how the demon had obtained the victim if Selena had remained completely fine after the ritual. Kelster suddenly approached the older sister and declared that he had received the sacrifice from her and not from any other person. This news surprised the girl incredibly, because in theory this time she had no involvement in the ritual. The demon moved even closer to the miss and whispered in her ear that Lavaine probably spoke exactly the same as he did. In response, Rudis could not contain her emotions and even began to shake with horror, as things were even worse than she thought. With a trembling voice, the heroine asked if she had really once made a sacrifice to another ancient deity, but Kelster himself only laughed in response, since this situation amused him, so he reported that the lady had made hundreds of sacrifices. The heroine couldn't even believe what was happening for the first few seconds due to shock, and because of this, she opened her eyes wide. The demon continued to mock the poor girl, when suddenly, for some reason, he approached her right shoulder. He moved his fingers over it and said that there was some strange magic hovering over the lady that he had just removed. Rudis only now realized that it was precisely because of this incomprehensible energy that Lavaine could not respond to her calls, since he did not hear them. Suddenly, the lady remembered how Esther had touched this shoulder just recently, although it was only for a moment. But then the Emperor intervened in the conversation between the girl and the boy, shouting that the demon should speak with Selena. However, Kelster did not even glance at the second princess, who still could not control her own trembling. The blonde lady felt that attention was suddenly focused on her, and she hesitantly raised her head up. However, looking at the girl, the ancient deity said that he would definitely not accept such an offering as a sacrifice. Although Selena tried to talk to the demon, he said that he would talk to her a little later if he wanted. At that moment, Rudis was still thinking about how she had somehow managed to bring several hundred sacrifices to the gods at once. Not wanting to stay in the imperial palace, the heroine returned to the duchy, and there she was met by a man she already knew. It turned out to be Lavaine, who was finally able to come to her, because Kelster dispelled the magic that prevented him from doing so. The princess was surprised, as it was the first time she saw a deity so excited just because of her. Suddenly, the guy mentioned the second summoned god, and the lady guessed that they had already known each other before. Only now the demon spoke almost without stopping, as he began to worry greatly about the fact that he could not appear. Rudis never thought that she would ever receive support from an ancient deity, so she froze in surprise. The demon noticed that the girl wanted to ask him something, so he prepared to listen carefully to her words. So Rudis pulled herself together and asked if Kelster had really received a sacrifice from her, as he had recently said. Although Lavaine was uncomfortable talking about this topic, since he did not want to reveal the truth, the guy still confirmed these words. Rudis's heart sank, as the lady had expected a different answer, so she couldn't hold back and started screaming. Suddenly, Lavaine pulled the lady towards him, and in a soothing voice asked her not to think about such things, because it was too difficult. The princess partly agreed with the guy, but she still clenched her fists painfully, since she could not let go of her emotions easily. Distracting the emperor's daughter from her bad thoughts, the ancient deity leaned over to her and told her not to communicate with Kelster. The demon stroked the lady's head, but the heroine expressed doubts about whether the second deity would listen to her sister. Lavaine admitted that that guy would also only listen to Rudis, but his abilities would not help in destroying monsters. Before the miss had time to ask in surprise what this meant, the assistant leaned over to her and tenderly kissed her forehead. Rudis immediately jumped back in shock, since she never allowed anyone to do something like that, and the demon didn't even ask. All because Lavaine had to disappear again, but he promised that he would come to the girl again at any time she needed. As a result, the heroine was left alone again, and many incomprehensible thoughts were rushing around in her head because she did not know what to do. Literally, the next morning, rumors began to circulate among the aristocrats that a second ancient deity had appeared in the empire. For this reason, an official letter with a plan for further action arrived in the Duchy of Arctis this morning. Serapis was unhappy that the aristocrats were asking to postpone the trip to the next city until Selena got ready. The butler calmed the boy down and explained that it was all because the second successful summoning of the demon had aroused great interest. The sir looked at the lady with concern and asked if she was all right with such bad news for her reputation. But the lady pretended to expect something like this, so as not to make her friend worry about her even more. But inside herself, Miss knew that her sister would not be able to give any orders to the second summoned deity. The heroine was worried about what was happening to Selena now, and she was right, because she was kneeling before the demon. This is all because the girl recently had a dream about how her father suddenly starts getting angry at her too, because of her uselessness. Selena sincerely did not understand why the man spoke to her so badly, because he was always angry only at Rudy's. Suddenly, Miss discovered that she had exactly the same clumsy leg as her older sister. The princess screamed in horror in her dream, because her greatest fear and nightmare had just come true. And even after waking up from sleep, the girl continued to scream loudly and be afraid of what she dreamed about. This continued until, from an excess of emotions, the lady finally lost consciousness, falling to the floor. 3 days later, Sir Arctus and Rudis finally arrived at the imperial palace, as it was no longer possible to delay. They were talking about a difficult topic, and Miss admitted that the aristocrats seemed to have stopped perceiving the monsters as a threat. Serapis confirmed this guess, explaining that most people had never even seen these monsters. And now, when the princess had the ancient deities, the inhabitants relaxed completely, although the forces of the second could not save them. However, Rudy suspected that she was the only one who knew that Kelster could not help in the fight. As soon as the allies arrived at the palace, they were unexpectedly met by Count Abbott, who wanted to be on their side. The lady asked the guy in surprise where the Duke was, who always personally helped the Emperor. Imagine the heroine's surprise when the Count told her that everyone in the palace was persuading Kelster to serve Selena. After which, in order not to waste any more time, Abbott called the guests to follow him, as he decided to take them to the others. The first princess didn't quite understand why the guy was helping her, but now was not the time to ask clarifying questions. As the Emperor's unloved daughter walked towards the square, the aristocrats turned in her direction with displeasure. But the heroine quickly forgot about their cruel looks, because she saw something much more terrible than evil people. Right in the center of the imperial palace square, Barthold loudly cursed Selena for not getting up from her knees. The man demanded that the lady explain why her demon wouldn't even leave the room, and she continued to shake. Eventually, this angered the ruler so much that he began to shout even louder, the more frightened he became. Suddenly, his assistant noticed that the first princess had approached them and warned his master about it. The emperor turned back with displeasure, since this girl could greatly interfere with all his plans to gain power. Rudis knew that no one had invited her, but she still said that she would like to leave for the next city right now. Barthold angrily asked if the girl had found out that her sister was not coping with her role and had come to demand something. To this, the heroine confidently replied that only the ruler saw everything in this way, and she simply wanted to save people. His Majesty even took a step back because of this accusation and stated that he does a lot for the empire. The argument between the first princess and her father was silently watched by all the people around, and everyone was now drawing their own conclusions. Suddenly, Rudis asked everyone out loud whether the emperor really wanted to gain power for himself and not to save people. Upon hearing